to both of the contributors. Welcome to each of you, ladies and gentlemen. Chee Soon Juan, is there a Singapore alternative? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor John Keane, Professor Lily Rahim, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the Sydney Democracy Network, Sydney Ideas, and Sydney Southeast Asia Center for giving me this opportunity to address all of you. I've been to Sydney University a couple of times already, and each time I've been made to feel very welcome. This is a little different in Singapore, as you might expect. A few years ago, when I visited the National University of Singapore, I was very promptly surrounded by security officials and told to leave. I then visited another university, the Nanyang Technological University, and some mass communication students came up to me and wanted to do an interview. I duly obliged, but then the president of the university, no less, intervened and forbade the publication of the report. So I've been grappling with this problem and how I can talk to university students. I finally managed to figure out how I can do it. All I have to do is get on a plane, fly 4,000 miles south to this place that you all call Australia, and voila, I can talk to university students again. You know, in a place like in Singapore, things are very different. And this is one of those things which people outside of Singapore seldom get to see and hear. Normally, you read about the headlines, the orderliness, the efficiency, the great airport, and pristine parks. And I might add very well-deserved accolades. Since independence more than 50 years ago, we've had a government under the PAP which has felt that placed a premium on orderliness and efficiency because that contributed to respectable standards of living. Unfortunately, as of late, there has been a distinct deterioration in the quality of life in Singapore. There are 7,000 persons per square kilometer, and that makes us the third most densely populated country in the world. As you can imagine, life in such a densely populated country can be quite stressful. A survey by Taylor Nelson Sofres found that Singaporeans are most likely to suffer from depression, stress, and fatigue than most of their Asian counterparts. Psychiatrists report that 90% of their patients are grappling with mental health issues caused by stress from work. The International Labour Organization, in a 2011 Global Wages report, found that Singaporeans work the most number of hours, but at the same time see their real incomes falling. The Randstad Group, just recently this year, reported that Singaporean workers are the least happy in Asia. We rank 70th out of 194 societies in the Quality of Life Index. The Quality of Life Index includes the assessment of factors such as economic performance, leisure, culture, freedom, cost of living, and so on. And in the Happy Planet Index, we rank dismal 90th out of 151 countries. A picture like this is very commonplace in Singapore, where you have the elderly some of them tottering and barely able to stand up, continue to have to work and clean as cleaners, cleaning tables. And if you've been to the Singapore airport, you'll see some of them pushing trolleys, those carts that you use for your baggage, and cleaning toilets. I had an Australian friend coming up, and we went to a food court like this to have dinner. And she was absolutely shocked when, following dinner, an elderly person came up with a dishcloth to clear our plates and bowls and to clean the table. But in Singapore, we hardly bat an eye. In 2012, 467 persons committed suicide. That's the highest in 20 years. And it's an increase of 30% from the previous year, 2011. The Samaritans of Singapore, a group that works to prevent suicides, attributed the suicides to extremes in living conditions, stressful living conditions in the country. In terms of income inequality, the ratio of top 20% income to the bottom 20% income is the highest among comparable economies. On the one end, you get Japan and the Scandinavian countries, and then you move to your right, and then you see countries like the UK, Portugal, United States, and Singapore is the highest. You talk about the United States, you hear this about the 1% of the wealthiest owning 50% of the wealth in the country, and the stark income inequality there. Well, Singapore is higher in terms of our Gini coefficient. The average real change in monthly income, household income, for work among working households from 2000 to 2012, you take a look at the poorest 10% decile, so a negative change of 1.1%. Compare this to the richest 10%, you see a huge increase in income change. Now this is a Singapore that doesn't quite fit the postcard picture of a gleaming metropolis, economically successful. But as I mentioned earlier on, the situation has deteriorated to a point where Singaporeans are no longer willing to sit idly by. In February 2013, there was a protest against the government's plans to bring in foreign workers into the country to augment our population size from the current 5 million to 7 million. Now, this may be unremarkable in a country like Australia, but in Singapore, where the islands have been silenced by decades of autocratic rule, this was historic. Now, if I showed you this picture, you would never have guessed that it is Singapore. But in December last year, a riot, the first in half a century, broke out in Little India. Security vehicles were overturned and torched, and dozens of police personnel were injured.
Dr. Shea, people have been arrested for rioting in Singapore before.
I'll address that during the Q&A when we've got some time, right? Last year, hackers from an online group who called themselves Anonymous hacked into the Straits Times, the leading government-run newspaper, and posted anti-government messages. And this young man has been prosecuted for organizing the Million Mask March in Singapore in opposition to new regulations that would curtail internet use. 15 people donned the Guy Fawkes mask and are gathered in downtown Singapore. Again, unprecedented. Last month, Singaporeans awoke to a sign that was spray painted on the roof of a block of flats, which, by the way, isn't far from where I lived, and a spray painted expletives against the ruling party. How they got up to the roof, that's a whole mystery in and of itself. But the bottom panel there, you can see the graffiti. Now, soon after this incident, and by the way, vandalism in Singapore is not a misdemeanor like you would have here in Australia and other countries. In Singapore, vandalism carries heavy penalty, including if you are below 55, 50, you're liable for caning. Now, soon after this incident, another individual defaced several bus stop signs protesting. I beg your pardon, I don't have that picture in here, but there was an individual who had spray painted, again using marker pens, I beg your pardon, protesting against the withholding of our CPF pension savings. A 71-year-old man was arrested for the deed. Now, bloggers, both anonymous and otherwise, are coming out in droves to point out the follies and foibles of the government, who seem to be in a rather cooperative mood in providing the fodder. And yet Lee Kuan Yew refuses to admit that Singapore is facing unprecedented challenges. He continues to insist that one-party rule, a party that has of late demonstrated shocking lack of competence and foresight, is the way forward. Now, incompetence and lack of foresight are not words you usually associate with the PAP government. And yet, the facts speak for themselves. In 2008, what Americans call a high-value terrorist suspect escaped from a maximum security facility. Now, how did he escape? He went to the toilet, opened the window, threw out 7 rolls of toilet paper, jumped through the window, using the toilet paper as a landing pad, and walked out of the facility. It was later revealed that the CCTVs were all not working. In another instance, a Malaysian woman drove through the checkpoint on the causeway between Singapore and Malaysia without being checked by the Singapore Customs and drove around in Singapore for 3 days, undetected by the police, before she was spotted when she visited the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And the mass rapid transit system has been breaking down with such frequency that it's come to be expected nowadays. Now, in 2010, hospitals in Singapore found themselves facing a bed crunch, and patients had to be placed along corridors instead of in the wards. The Minister for Health at that time promised that such a situation would not recur. That never again promise lasted for 4 years. In 2014, hospitals now had to build tents to accommodate an overflow of patients again. Now, the Commission of Inquiry that was set up to investigate the riot in Little India found that there were insufficient number of officers available, that they were not properly equipped, radio airwaves jammed at the crucial moment, the commanding officer did not have any idea how many men he had at his disposal, and officers on the scene admitted that they were not trained to handle a full-scale riot. And when the riot police finally arrived at the scene, it did not have the numbers to contain the mob. The Singapore government in 2008, during the financial meltdown in the US, lost about $120 billion. That's about a third of our foreign reserves, when the investments in the UBS, Merrill Lynch, and Citigroup went bust. It was only the TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, money given out by the US government that saved the banks and our investments. Despite all this, Lee Kuan Yew says, "I don't believe that Singapore can produce 2 top-class teams. We haven't got the talent to produce 2 top-class teams. We will wait and see how constructive the opposition can be or will be." 2 things. 1, If the current administration and Mr. Lee's idea of a top-class team, then Singapore is in a lot more trouble than we think. 2, is it true that Singapore doesn't have sufficient talent to produce an alternative to the PAP? In the past, we have had a corporate lawyer, a former solicitor general, a judge, medical doctors, academics, journalists who joined and led the opposition in Singapore. Lee imprisoned them without detention, sued them for defamation, and prosecuted them in criminal courts. For nearly a decade, in the 1980s, there was no opposition representation in Parliament. All the opposition leaders were either in prison or in exile. Repression in the more than half a century left an opposition decimated and people utterly bereft of their political rights. The demise of human rights also led to the evaporation of transparency and accountability, resulting in the dismal state of governance that we witness today. Now, presently, the Singapore Democratic Party is regaining our toehold in opposition politics. With the help of the internet, more and more Singaporeans are seeing and hearing what the opposition has to say, and our support has been growing. One of the most important factors that the opposition can contribute to the establishment of a democratic polity in Singapore is the provision of an alternative to the PAP. I'd like to take a few moments to present to you the series of policy papers that my colleagues and I have published over the past 3 years. Let's start with population. Arguably, the most important of our papers is the one on immigration. As I mentioned, the government announced plans to increase the population to 7 million from the current 5. Its strategy is to replace Singaporeans with foreigners. This may sound far-fetched, but it is real, very real. Given the current social tension and unemployment and/or underemployment that the influx of foreign workers has created, it is a policy in search of trouble. And the way things are going, I think it may have succeeded. So what's the alternative? We propose to slow down immigration and ensure that our infrastructure and employment situation is able to cope with the increase before we open our floodgates. What we are proposing is to vet foreigners coming into our economy, especially the PMETs, your so-called your professionals, managers, engineers, and technicians, and ensure that only the genuinely qualified are allowed to work in Singapore, an approach not unlike what Australia has been doing all these years. Another important policy paper that we published is housing. Public housing in Singapore has become so expensive that the younger generations are not able to afford it. If they do get a loan to buy one of these flats, they end up with massive loans that will take them up to 30 years to pay off. And Singaporeans typically use their Central Provident Fund, the CPF savings, to pay off these loans, leaving them with little or nothing to retire on. A tiny flat will set you back between $300,000 to $350,000. And why are they so expensive? That's because, according to our estimate, there's a 100% markup in price. What we have advocated in our housing policy is for the government to sell the flats at cost and not include the cost of land, which the government nationalized decades ago. And that way, young couples can afford to buy the flats and they will not be saddled with these crippling loans and leave their CPF savings unmolested. Healthcare. Singapore remains one of the last few countries in the world that does not have universal healthcare. Even the US, with the passage of Obamacare, has moved towards universal healthcare. Now, this newspaper headline reads, 95-year-old Samsui woman commits suicide, falls and is admitted to hospital but doesn't want to burden their children with medical costs. And that's why she committed suicide. Singapore has the highest out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure in East Asia. The government pays only 30% of the country's total healthcare expenditure compared to 70% in comparable economies. I think Australia, the government pays about 70% of the total healthcare expenditure. As a consequence, Singaporeans are in debt of $110 million to public hospitals as at end of 2011. Many put off the crucial health screenings and early treatment. Some, like Madam Liu, take their own lives. The SDP advocates that the government expenditure for healthcare be increased to 70%. We also want to introduce a national insurance scheme where government and citizens co-contribute, and where upon hospitalization, the government pays 90% of the bill and the patient picks up the remaining 10%, up to $2,000 a year. In this way, healthcare will be made affordable for everyone, and the poor will not have to compete with billionaires for first-rate medical treatment. Now, as for the economy, we want to see the legislation of national minimum wage. There still isn't one, as well as the introduction of unemployment insurance. Currently, there is no such legislation, which is contributing to the income inequality that I mentioned earlier. We also want to see the government getting out of business. Many of you have heard of Temasek Holdings, which is the business arm of the government. And the people suspect that it is using our CPF savings to fund some of its investments overseas. The government denies this, but we cannot verify this as the government has been less than completely transparent about its transactions. Singaporean suspicion of the government is fueled by the move to withhold our CPF savings upon retirement, returning it to us only in small installments. We want the government to divest the multitude of companies and businesses under Temasek Holdings, and we want our CPF savings to be returned to us when we retire. Now, I talked at length about the stress that Singaporean workers are subjected to earlier on. That's only half of the story. The other half concerns our children. In Singapore, students are put through a school system that piles on work and streams them according to their exam results at a very early age. This has brought about horrific consequences. 22% of Singaporean children aged between 6 and 12 have indicated or entertained thoughts of killing themselves. 7.2% have symptoms of depression. 1 in 3 students say they sometimes think that life is not worth living because of the fear of exams. A survey a few years ago showed that while the majority of American and Japanese children said that losing a friend or the death of their parents was their number one fear, Singaporean students said that not achieving good grades was what they were most afraid of. Over 50% of children are short-sighted. Singapore is the myopia capital of the world. Many of these children don't just entertain thoughts of suicide, they actually act it out. A 10-year-old schoolgirl, her name was Laisha, climbed over the parapet of a 5th floor of her apartment block and leapt to her death. 2 weeks before she committed suicide, she said that she did not want to be reincarnated as a human being because she did not want to have to do homework ever again. The last straw came when she fared poorly in her mid-year exams. Laisha's case is one of the few that have made it into the news. Many go unreported. We need to stop this. We need to stop this insane practice of psychologically maiming our children and driving them to suicide. We need to let our children be children. We're at the same time killing off their creativity, a quality that is so desperately lacking in our workforce. Our education system produces the double whammy of inflicting harm on our children while suffocating their creative potential. Our education policy spells out steps to ensure a healthy, well-rounded education for our students by removing the focus on exams and reducing the syllabi. We also want to broaden the curriculum so that we can produce intelligent, well-adjusted citizens who can think creatively and critically. Now, why does the SDP put in all this effort to draw up detailed alternative plans for Singapore? Through the decades, Singaporeans have been told that there isn't and cannot be a credible opposition. They have become conditioned into thinking that there is no alternative. In such a situation, it is a case of better the devil you know, and voters will continue voting for the PAP despite their qualms and misgivings about the present situation. It is human nature that we fear the unknown. Now, in psychology, you learn that it is easier to change behavior, in this case, voting behavior, if there is a substitute to the existing option. It's not enough to ask voters to vote against something. If we are going to facilitate a switch in voting behavior, it is more effective if we ask the people to vote for something. And we have painted an alternative picture of the future for Singaporeans. That alternative is not only not scary, but instead sound and good for the future of our nation. It is an alternative that appeals to hope, not fear. One where we appeal to our better angels and not our basest, most selfish instincts. It is an alternative that measures progress by our happiness and quality of life rather than just how quickly the GDP grows. An alternative where the people have a say. In a democratic society where the government serves rather than sues, debates rather than detains, and raises up rather than dumps down the people. An alternative where our success is measured by the content of our character, not the size of our bank accounts. An alternative where our guiding light is compassion, not crass consumerism. An alternative where egalitarianism, not elitism, forms the bedrock of our policies. Now, I want to take a moment to address my fellow Singaporeans in this room tonight. For the better part of the 1980s, I was studying in the United States. And during that time, I've had several people asking me, will you return to your home country when you graduate? My answer was always, why not? And since I returned, I've been sacked, I've been sued, been imprisoned. But just last week, an Australian friend of mine asked me that same question, are you going to go back to Singapore after you finish this fellowship? My answer has not changed. I know that many of you here have decided to work and live away from Singapore. I respect that. But I also know that you can take a Singaporean out of Singapore, but you cannot take Singapore out of a Singaporean. What with all our laws and our mayors and our laws, we will always be Singaporean. You have family, friends back home, and I know that you continue to follow developments there, and you long also to see democracy come to our nation. You don't have to feel helpless or be passive about it. Nowadays, with the internet, with social media, that whole communication process has been facilitated. I remember years ago when I was in Melbourne, when J.B. Jeyaretnam, some of you might know him, was constantly hounded by Kuan Yew and was bankrupted. And he had come to Melbourne and come to my place where we discussed a fundraising activity, a dinner for him. We tried to push the message out, but of course that was the pre-social media days, and it never took off. He was crestfallen. And before he could contest in the last general election, he passed away. Situation is dramatically different nowadays. we can constantly communicate through the internet. Singapore is at a crossroads. What we do today, how we respond to the present challenges, will determine how we live in the future. And this is why I want to ask all our Singaporeans here tonight to take the initiative to form networks of your own, either online or in person. Next week, I'll be speaking at the Australian Institute for International Affairs, and I will be talking about changes, the possibility of change under the new Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong. The way that things are going, I am not hopeful. And this is why we have to press on with political reform. Singapore is my home. I know of no other. And when someone comes into your home and robs you of all your possessions, you don't run. You stand and you fight. You stay and you demand the return of all that you possess. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it because there is still something called justice. You do it for our children, our future generations. No, I will not leave Singapore, because if I leave Singapore, the PAP wins. And if the PAP wins, the people lose. The people cannot lose. Come, join me in this admittedly long and arduous, but ultimately exciting and meaningful journey to a better place called democracy. We will get there. Singapore will get there. Victory for democracy is just a matter of time. I say this not with hubris, but an abiding sense of humility and a firm grasp of history. Thank you very much.